thank you to the Center for Asia Pacific Studies for organizing this event today. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I want to start today's talk. I'm going to jump right in. And I want to start today's talk by briefly covering what I'd like to discuss. And, I'm a historian by trade, so I want to provide a sort of historical context to Pedro Arrupe's writing about Japan. And the core of today's talk comes from a translation of this book, Yo viví la bomba atómica, that Pedro Arrupe wrote in the 50s, and which I've recently completed the translation of. And I want to cover the contents of that book. I want to follow, in a sense, the structure of Arrupe's book, which is broadly divided into sort of four general categories, which cover the history and culture of Japan, Arrupe's vision of the sort of traditions of Japan, especially the spiritual traditions of Japan, Arrupe's impressions of the future of Christianity in Japan, and then his personal experiences being in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb was dropped on that city, and then his activities after returning from Japan. So I want to cover the content of the book as best I can with the time allotted. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the Jesuits in Japan, part of the long tradition that Pedro Arrupe formed a part of. So I think it's worth going right to the beginning. And I want to discuss some of the earliest records of Japan written by Europeans of any type. And many of those records are written by the Jesuits. So in 1549, the first Jesuit missionary, Francisco Xavier, of the Society of Jesus, arrives in Japan, and he's later venerated as a saint. And at the time when St. Francis Xavier arrives, Japan was in the middle of a civil war, in the Sengoku period, the warring states period. And the entire country was divided into small domains, which were at war with each other, each one ruled by a daimyo, a kind of baron. And it was a state of war. But nonetheless, the impressions of Japan that these early Jesuit missionaries formed are quite surprising, and I think enormously interesting, especially when they're lined up with other European accounts of, from their perspective, pagan nations. And I think it's worth looking at a few of these. So St. Francis Xavier himself said, "Judging by the people we have so far met, I would say that the Japanese are the best race ever discovered, and I do not think you will find their match among the pagan nations. They are very sociable, usually good and not malicious, and much concerned with their honor, which they prize above everything else. For the most part, they are poor, but they do not despise the poverty of nobles and common folk. The people show much politeness to each other. They prize their weapons and place much reliance on them. Both nobles and commoners carry a sword and dagger from the age of 14. They will not suffer any affront or contemptuous speech. The people hold the social relations in great respect, and in their turn, the nobles are proud to serve their lord, obeying their least command. And this, I fancy, is not due to any fear of punishment which the Lord might inflict for disobedience, but rather on account of the loss of honor that they would suffer if they were to do otherwise." So here we see a very interesting impression, and it is, one of these early impressions are in a sense the sort of grand context into which Pedro Arrupe is going to add his voice to the conversation. But this impression is positive, it's overwhelmingly positive, and in particular, St. Francis Xavier is taken with this characteristic of obedience, what he sees as a very valuable trait, a very important trait, and something that he regards he holds in very high regard. So there's several other Jesuits, and Alessandro Valignano stands out as, again, sort of reiterating a very similar impression of Japan and the Japanese, and he says, "The people are white and cultured, even the common folk and peasants are well brought up and are so remarkably polite that they give the impression that they were trained at court. In this respect, they are superior not only to other Eastern peoples, but also to Europeans as well. They're very capable and intelligent, and the children are quick to grasp lessons and instructions. They learn to read and write our language far more quickly and easily than the children in Europe." So unilaterally positive impression, right? And this is going to have ramifications for the sort of further missionary activities that the Jesuits conduct in Japan. And Valignano continues, he says, "I fancy there are no people in the world more punctilious about their honor than the Japanese, for they will not put up with a single insult or even a word spoken in anger. Thus you speak, and indeed must speak, courteously, even to the most menial laborers and peasants, because they will not have it otherwise." As a point on the sort of weapon bearing, of course, that's indicative of the moment in which these people are arriving. They are arriving at the height of a civil war, and the emerging military aristocracy, the samurai, are carrying swords, and even quite a lot of non-samurai are bearing weapons as insignia of their position. Valignano continues, he says, "They're very prudent and discreet in all their dealings with others, and never weary anybody by recounting their troubles or by complaining and grumbling, as people do in Europe. When they do go visiting, the etiquette demands that they never say anything which might upset the host. They are also moderate in their emotions and never show them outwardly, even though they may feel them in their hearts. They keep their anger and rage so tightly under control that rarely does anybody show any vexation. For this reason, neither in the streets nor in the very houses is there any shouting or brawling. Husbands do not beat or shout at their wives, neither do fathers their sons, nor masters their servants. On the contrary, they outwardly appear very calm and deal with each other, either by the messages that they send or by their cultured words which they speak. In this way, even though they may be exiled, killed, or thrown out of their homes, everything is done quietly and in good order. So this is, again, a society where violence is very present. Everyone's carrying swords. There's a literal civil war. Exile and executions can happen. But nonetheless, these Jesuits are observing the orderliness with which it's all taking place. Right? And that sense of order is something that 300 years later, Arrupe is also going to notice. Now, there's another Jesuit, and this will be the last one, from this early, sort of late 16th century arrivals, Cosme de Torres, and he says, these Japanese are better disposed to embrace our holy faith than any other people in the world. They are as prudent as could be desired, and are governed by reason just as much as, or even more than Spaniards. And he was a Spaniard himself, so he's not randomly throwing shade at Spaniards. They are more inquisitive than any other people I have met. No men in the wide world more like to hear sermons on how to serve the Creator and save their souls. Their conversation is so polite that they all seem to have been brought up in the palaces of great nobles. This seems to be a recurring theme. In fact, the compliments they pay each other are beyond description. They grumble but little about their neighbors and envy nobody. They do not gamble, just as theft is punished with death, so also gambling. As a pastime, they practice with their weapons, at which they are extremely adept, or write couplets, just as the Romans composed poetry. And most of the gentry occupy themselves in this way. They are very brave and put much faith in their weapons. Boys over the age of 13 carry a sword and dagger and never take them off. So this impression, and I hope it's sort of striking to you in a sense how very often there's a comparison to Europeans, and it's a favorable comparison. It is a comparison where Jesuits are arriving in Japan and they are struck by the civilization that they're encountering. And in fact, they're comparing it to Europe, and they're saying, these people are more civilized than the Europeans, than the Spaniards. There's a final point. This is actually not by a Jesuit. It's by François Caron, in fact, a Protestant. But I think it's an interesting footnote, and it will be relevant in a moment when we see Arrupe's impressions of Japan as well. But he says, children are carefully and tenderly brought up. The parents strike them seldom or never. And although they may cry all night, endeavor to treat them with patience, judging that infants have no understanding. And therefore, they are to be encouraged with indulgences and examples. It is remarkable to see how orderly and how modestly little children in Japan of 7 or 8 years old behave themselves, their discourse and answers savouring of riper age, and far surpassing any I have seen in any other country. So, we're going to stop there, but you get a sense, I think, of the tremendously positive impression that the Jesuits had of Japan. And for their part, the Jesuit contact, and indeed the European contact, also had a fairly profound and in some ways formative effect on this late Sengoku, this warring states Japan. And one rather trivial example, but there's a theory that the Japanese tea ceremony, the formal structures of which was being formalized in that period, may have been influenced by the Catholic Mass, by witnessing the Catholic Mass being conducted by these Spanish and Portuguese and Italian missionaries. And here you see I'm showing a few teacups with evidently Christian insignia produced in this period in Japan. And here's a little incense holder, I think designed to look like a padre, like a Catholic priest. Unfortunately, the heyday of Christianity in Japan in this period comes to an abrupt end. And in fact, it ends with persecutions, and very brutal ones. So as the Civil War resolves itself, increasingly powerful leaders start to emerge in Japan, and they are not entirely sympathetic to the Christians. And perhaps most prominent among these is Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the great unifiers of Japan, shown here. And he objected to Christianity on several grounds. He objected to Christianity on spiritual grounds. He regarded that Japan had an indigenous religion, or an indigenous spiritual tradition in the form of what we call today Shinto, kind of animist worship of to some extent nature spirits, but also spiritual divinity of individual humans, and also Buddhism. It was imported from India. Very, very important spiritual tradition in Japan. And so he thought, there's no need for another religion, we've got plenty. But there was another objection, and this objection in some ways is deeper, and in some regards we might call a Confucian objection. Without going into enormous detail, the essence of it was that the Christians were intractable on a very particular point, which is they believed there was a higher authority than him, a higher authority than Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and that was not acceptable to Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He wanted to be the ruler of Japan, and he wanted to be the supreme authority. And the Christians would routinely say, of course I'll obey all of your orders, but not if they contravene divine orders. Not if you command me to sin, that I cannot do, right? And in particular, if you command me to become an apostate, I refuse. Right? And this was not acceptable to Toyotomi, so he wanted to get rid of them all. And he wasn't alone. His successor, through a sort of bloody process, Tokugawa Ieyasu, is the guy who ends up really running the show, and then his dynasty become the rulers of Japan for 300 odd years. And he really was not keen on Christians at all. And posthumously, he was elevated to godhead. He became a divinity, he became a god after he died. Right? He became the Tosho Daigongen. And you can sort of well imagine how, in the context of a world in which humans can achieve divinity, Christians are not necessarily, they're not going to be one. Right? It's not going to work. Right? So there's opposition, there's spiritual oppositions, and then there's this opposition on the basis of disobedience. And the persecution is very, very brutal. So we get these edicts against Christianity. Famously, we have 26 martyrs in Nagasaki. And of the sort of 300,000 odd Christians, a fairly large number of converts in the space of 40 years, the vast majority are forced to recant their religion, or they're directly killed. They're tortured and killed in increasingly grisly ways. And the Nagasaki martyrs become sort of a famous symbol of it, but they were just a few of the many, many people who were put to death in brutal ways throughout Japan. And the persecution, in some way, the persecution of Christians is intimately tied to the emergence of Japan as a modern state. And it's a topic that's sort of enormous interest, which is that the Japanese government around the early 17th century conducts the first census, the first comprehensive census of its people in history, really. And as part of this census, every single Japanese household has to go to their local Buddhist temple, if available, or sort of secular office, if not. And there they have to write down their name and describe the full contents of their household. And they have to desecrate a symbol of the Christian faith. They have to ritually, in front of a Buddhist inquisitor or a government officer, they have to stamp upon or spit on an image of the Virgin Mary or of Christ. And these images are mass-produced. They're required throughout the country. They become part of the process of the 17th century equivalent of going to the DMV to renew your driving license. You also have to commit an act of blasphemy against the Christian faith. And these things are called fumie, or stamping pictures, all over the place. And in fact, when a baby is born, you go register your baby at your local temple, you have to take its little baby foot and stomp it on an image of Christ to show that the baby is not a Christian. So this is an extremely thorough, systematic rooting out of the religion throughout the country. Of course, some Christians do survive, and there's a whole story of the Gakure Kirishitan, the hidden Christians, the ones who maintain their faith throughout this long period of persecution. But we're not going to talk about them today, with apologies. So I want to skip ahead. This state of affairs remains in place for 300 odd years. And then ultimately Japan opens up, or is opened up, in part by American gunboat diplomacy, and in part by internal turmoil that inevitably leads to opening up to the world. And part of that opening up involves the legalization of Christianity. So Christians come back into the country, foreigners are allowed back into the country, and in fact the first church in Japan is constructed in this 19th century period, and it's the Church of the 26 Martyrs of Japan, built in Nagasaki. So this is, in a sense, the grand context of Christianity and Jesuit contact with Japan, into which Pedro Arrupe arrives. So Arrupe was a Basque priest from Spain, and he trained as a medical doctor in Madrid. And in fact, he trained with a Nobel laureate in medicine, or a man who would go on to get a Nobel laureate in medicine. And as you will see in a second, his medical training is highly relevant to his experiences in later life. And in 1927, he joins the Society of Jesus. He is moved by a miraculous experience that he has involving healing at Lourdes, and he begs his superiors to send him to Japan. And in 1938, they do. He goes to Japan, and he ultimately has a long career in Japan, over 20 years in Japan, and then goes on to do many other things. And this book that he wrote, Jobibi la Bomba Atomica, he writes it later. I'm currently preparing it for publication with the help of Professor Andrew Barchet of the University of California, Berkeley. And I want to go into the contents of that book. It's enormously interesting. So the first part of this book, what Arrupe tries to do is he tries to reconstruct, in a sense, Japanese intellectual and spiritual history. He tries to create an image of what is going on spiritually in Japan. And this image that he produces, he sees a synthesis of different strains of thought. And anyone who has studied Japanese history will be familiar with these. He sees Shinto, the indigenous animist tradition. He sees Buddhism, this extremely sophisticated Indian, then Chinese, then Korean organized religion and its many, many strains. And he sees Confucianism, political and social philosophy from China with an ancient pedigree. And he tries to sort of examine each of these. And I think it's worth pondering a couple of his examinations to see how he understands the future of Christianity in Japan. So his assessment of Shinto is fairly positive. He says of Shinto, a vision of nature is laid out, not cold, like that of a museum, guidebook in hand, but heartfelt and loving, yet leading unthinkingly to worshipful in its paganism. It lacks the strength to perceive beyond the veil of creation's beauty and behold the infinite splendor of the Creator. So he sees in Shinto, he sees a tradition that admires nature, which he approves of. It's, in his view, in a sense, innocent. But of course, being a Christian, he sees that it's flawed because it doesn't admire the Creator. It doesn't see past the beauty of nature. And he goes at great length discussing his sort of view of Shinto, but I think you've got the right idea with that. And he presents us with a series of poems which he thinks illustrate this Shinto sensibility. And they all show a sort of admiration for nature, a pleasure in nature. And here's one, he says, "Why tether your horse to a flowering cherry tree? If the horse moves, the petals will fall." So this is a sense of sensitivity, of appreciation for nature, which he sees as universally positive and quintessentially Shinto. Of Buddhism, he's much more negative. And it's hard to disambiguate this from the experience of Christian persecution in Japan and the fact that a fair amount of it was conducted by Buddhist temples and by Buddhist inquisitors. So I've got a feeling that Arube was arriving at his assessment of Buddhism in a fairly dour state of mind. But here's what he says. He says, "The second component, initially superimposed upon and later blended into the first, is Buddhism, imported from India via Korea. This element introduces a note of chiaroscuro into the otherwise luminous innocence of the Japanese spirit. Buddhist philosophy did, however, leave a pessimistic, shadowy imprint on the Japanese spirit, which it infused with a certain despairing sadness, and drove eventually to nihilistic self-destruction. Since then, the Japanese will often perceive life as akin to a trail of foam, which a boat leaves in its wake, disappearing without trace, or indeed like a dewdrop resting on a flower petal, undone by the morning sun. This change occurred over centuries, and left its corresponding cultural and literary mark." And here, too, he illustrates it with another poem, also about cherry blossom, which he sees as representing that Buddhist pessimism, the sufferings of this world, even when the cherry trees bloom, in spite of their flowers. I suspect this is a poem by Issa, one of the great haiku writers. And you can see here how, the author of this poem is looking at the cherry trees, but is unable to get past the suffering of the world. And the first noble truth of Buddhism is the truth of suffering and impermanence. And I think Arube is very hung up on this. He feels, and it's a sort of an interesting observation, he feels that this familiarity with death, this acceptance of death and suffering is something that comes into Japan from Buddhism. Could go on at length. I want to move on. He also discusses Confucianism, and on this he has an enormous amount to say. He's generally positive. He generally sees Confucianism's high importance on family, importance on familial duty, on filial piety, importance of obedience to authority. All of these are things that a Catholic approves of. Things very important. However, on the point of the treatment of women, he associates it with quite negative things. And so he actually describes it as the enslavement of women. He thinks that Confucianism situates women in a very low social status. And he gives a large number of examples of these. One of them that he gives is, he says, sometimes you'll see a young couple walk by. The woman will be carrying a child on her back and various parcels, or the man will be smoking a cigarette with his hands in his pockets. You'll be very surprised by what seemed to you as a lack of manners. More so if you board a packed train, and note that those sitting down are the men, while the women remain on their feet. And he gives several anecdotes to this effect, and one of the anecdotes he gives is that he was riding the train in Yokohama, and he saw a Japanese couple, a man and a woman, and he got up and offered his seat to the woman, as a Spaniard from the 30s would, and the woman thanks him, and then gives a seat to her husband. Right? So he's sort of absolutely deranged by this. Now, Arube was also arrives in Japan in 1938, and he conducts a series of activities there. And in 1941, Pearl Harbor happened. And almost immediately after, he is arrested. He's put under arrest, and he's put in solitary confinement. And this is a moment of, of desperation. And on Christmas Day of 1941, he thinks he hears voices outside of his cell, and he thinks that they've come to execute him, to put him to death. But instead, it turns out that it's a few of his congregants, a few of the people that he's converted to Christianity, have come and they're singing a Christmas carol outside his the cell, right? And so this is you can imagine his relief, and he says, "Suddenly above the murmur that was reaching me, there arose a soft, sweet, consoling Christmas carol, one of the songs which I myself had taught to my Christians. I was unable to contain myself. I burst into tears. They were my Christians who, heedless of the danger of being themselves in prison, had come to console me." So Rube is in Japan at a time of what Japanese historians call the Dark Valley of Japanese history. Total descent into militarism, a descent into very brutal social control, and of course the waging of a war in the Pacific, in East Asia, and Southeast Asia, now with the USA as well. And in 1942, he moves to Hiroshima. And in Hiroshima, Arube tries to integrate himself into Japanese society. He tries to become a member of his local community, and he becomes extremely concerned with the spiritual well-being of the local community, and to some extent the physical well-being as well. His training as a doctor comes into play. A huge number of doctors in this period would have already been sent to the front to fight. In fact, many of the young men by 1942 would have been sent away to fight in sort of the various extended fronts of Japanese military expansion. And so Arube provides medical services to his local community. And he tries to convert everyone to Christianity, and he's not very successful. He's actually pretty unsuccessful. And he writes about this, and it is here that he situates himself in this grand Jesuit tradition. He sees this, there's hundreds of years of Jesuit experience of Japan, and he starts to ask himself what is wrong, and he's trying to come up with an answer. And he says, he speculates, he says, a comprehensive, all-absorbing, and exclusive patriotism founded on a faith in and absolute reverence towards an emperor who was worshipped by the Japanese as a god. We can understand everything the emperor represents for the Japanese, not only a vehicle for transmitting a centuries-old tradition, the current emperor is 124th in an unbroken dynasty, but also the element that binds the mass of innumerable Japanese who live only to serve him. So the first obstruction from Arube's perspective to the conversion to Christianity is the presence of the emperor, and also the divinity of the emperor. The emperor is divine, the emperor is required to be worshipped, but the emperor has become, in Japanese, part of the kokutai, part of the national body, in a sense, indistinguishable from patriotism itself. To love Japan is to love the emperor. This at least is the way that imperial propaganda operated in 1942. He continues. This total dedication to the idea that contains the secret of Japan's achievements also explains something else of extreme interest: the obvious fact of Japan's resistance to the Catholic faith. Despite St. Francis Xavier writing 400 years ago in his letters that the Japanese were perfectly prepared for receiving the doctrine of Jesus Christ, we find today that notwithstanding enormous missionary efforts, there are, among the 84 million Japanese, only 160,000 Catholics. So after all this time, and hard-working missions, there's been relatively little success in converting the Japanese to Catholicism. So he says, was St. Francis wrong? Some people may wish to pronounce it evident that St. Francis was mistaken in his assessment, but to do so would be inaccurate. And by assessment, it's those very sanguine assessments of Japan and of the receptivity to the Christian faith of the Japanese that were made 300 years ago that we just read. And he says the Japanese character is very close to Catholicism, both emotionally and ideologically. This is what St. Francis intuited since his first contact with the Japanese, and what made him predict such a glorious future for the faith. Nevertheless, the slow acceptance of Catholicism in Japan is clear, mainly due to two linked factors: the challenging historical circumstances of the past centuries and the uncompromising commitment to the imperial ideal. Despite the loyalty of the handful of Catholics who unabatedly preserve their religious heritage, the bulk of the Japanese population has opposed with tenacity the spread of Catholicism. After being in Japan for a few years, we missionaries noted that this is a self-satisfied populace who feel that many of their problems have already been solved. On the one hand, the Shinto-Buddhist syncretism that fits their character so well takes care of the religious dimension, while from a human and ideological perspective they are well catered for by their exalted patriotism and their absolute commitment to country and emperor. All apostolic endeavor, therefore, crashed impotently against this unbreachable granite wall, which never displayed as much as a crack that might inspire any hope for its eventual demolition. So Arube is seeing, in a sense, what many historians have also seen, which is, from the Christian perspective, there is in a sense no vacuum. Japan is the Japanese are self-satisfied, is one way of putting it, but in terms of spiritual ideologies, social ideologies, socially structuring religions or systems of thought, there's a huge number of them available in Japan that have a very ancient pedigree. Be it the indigenous traditions of Shinto or Buddhism, Confucianism, and now this sort of imperial-centric, state Shinto patriotism. Right? All of these combined, that there's simply no vacuum into which Catholicism might insert itself. So this, I think, is enough of Arrupe's sort of vision of the state of things in Japan for Christians. I want to talk now about the more biographical side of things, which is Arrupe's experience of the bomb. And I'm afraid there's some fairly disturbing descriptions here and images. You did come to a lecture called I Survived the Atomic Bomb, though, so I hope you expected it. So Arrupe was in Hiroshima in 1945 on August 6th. And here's how he described that experience. He says, every day at around 5:30 in the morning, an American D-29 would appear in the sky on a reconnaissance sortie. Its timing was so extraordinarily precise that most days the announcement of its arrival coincided exactly with the invitation given to me to say the 5:30 Mass. Nobody was perturbed by the bomber's appearance. They even joked about it. It was nicknamed the American Post, and most remarked upon it with indifference. Months passed this way. And in a sense, it would have been, it's an interesting situation to have been, because by this point, by the time you get to August 6, 1945, conventional bombing, typically fire bombing, had already destroyed, I think, the largest 66 cities in Japan, barring Hiroshima. Nishinomiya, Kobe, Osaka, Tokyo had been completely razed to the ground with 120,000 deaths conservatively. So Japanese cities had been razed, but for whatever reason, Hiroshima, which is a reasonably important military depot, and Nagasaki had not. And Hiroshima and Kyoto was also spared thus far. So it's hard to know what Arrupe would have thought, but certainly the idea of civilian bombing was something that would have been on everyone's mind at this point. But Arrupe continues. He says, at 8:15, I was in my room with another padre when suddenly we saw an incredibly powerful light, like a flash of magnesium detonating in front of our eyes. Naturally, surprised, we got up to see what was happening, and on opening the door, we heard the most formidable explosion, akin to the roar of a terrible hurricane, that swept everything in its path, doors, windows, glass, flimsy walls, the shattered pieces of which began to fall on our heads. We flung ourselves, or were flung, to the ground. So what has happened is a nuclear bomb has struck Hiroshima. And Arrupe isn't aware of this. At the time, he doesn't know what a nuclear bomb is. Nobody does. In fact, he assumes a conventional bomb has been dropped in the backyard, right? That's the sort of assumption that a bomb has hit the yard. But realization dawns as the smoke starts to clear that Hiroshima doesn't exist anymore, right? And there's immediately following the blast a huge exodus of refugees from the epicenter of the bomb. The people who are sort of closest to the bomb, who've survived, who've not been instantly vaporized, the survivors are now straggling out, trying to get away from the burning and crumbling city. And Arrupe and his fellow padres, they're about 12 blocks out of the city center. They're living in a suburb. They all survive. Everyone, all but one survived. And they look at this stream of injured humans, and what do? But they travel into the epicenter to see what help they can get, right? And he describes what he sees there. He says, this was the state of the city moments after the explosion. One could barely walk among so much rubble. But another factor that hindered our progress was the endless flow of people that emanated wretchedly from the inferno. They fled as best they could, trying but failing to run, a rapid escape from that hell made impossible by their horrific injuries. I will never forget one of my first impressions of the aftermath of the bomb. A group of young women, 18 to 20 years old, dragging themselves on the ground, clinging to each other. One of them had a blister that extended over her entire chest. Half of her face was burned, and a cut on her head caused by a falling roof tile was so deep that it sheared away her scalp and exposed her skull. A great deal of blood flowed down her face. And like her, the next, and the next. If we continue the progression until we reach 150,000, we can begin to form a rough picture of Hiroshima. We continued to seek a way into the city, but still none presented itself. Then we did the only thing that one can do when faced with a hecatomb on this scale. Bereft of all human aid, we fell to our knees and prayed for guidance to heaven. Finally, remembering that many years ago I had studied medicine, I ran back to the house to try to gather things that could be of use. I found a medicine cabinet underneath the rubble with the doors blown off. From the ruins, I was able to recover a little bit of iodine, some aspirin, fruit salts, and bicarbonate of soda. These were my tools, with 200,000 victims waiting for assistance. What to do? Where to begin? I fell again to my knees, and I commended myself to the Lord our God. It was then that he helped me in a very special way, not with medicines, but with an idea which I am sure will make any doctor reading this smile, given the obvious absence of our resources. To help nature restore itself at all costs. To this end, we cleaned the house as much as possible, and used it to accommodate as many of the sick as it could hold, more than 150 people in total. So what they do is they convert the house that they were staying in, what remains of it, they convert that into a makeshift hospital. And they start to bring the injured into this hospital. And you can see this is a sort of extraordinary aerial view of Our Lady of Assumption Church right after the bomb. And you can just see I've circled there a group of priests, who might actually include Pedro Arrupe, right? So this is what they're going to try and do. They're going to try and create a little makeshift clinic to look after the injured. So at around 10 at night, we were able finally to reach the fathers at our residence. All 5 were injured. F. Schiller was dying. He'd suffered a cut to his head, and to stop the bleeding, since nothing else was at hand, they'd made him a big turban with newspaper and a shirt. But they had not noticed another wound behind his ear. A shard of glass had cut a very small artery in that spot, and he was slowly bleeding to death. We fashioned a stretcher from rough bamboo canes, and prepared to carry him back to Nagatska. Wincing with pain, yet able stoically to bring a smile to his lips, like a Japanese person, he said, "Father Arrupe, would you mind looking at my back? I feel something there." I turned him onto his stomach, and by the light of the torch, we saw that his back was completely riddled with pieces of broken glass. With a shaving razor, at this point a scalpel was the stuff of dreams, I removed more than 50 fragments. After the operation, slowly through the dark, we made the journey across the city towards the novitiate. Every 100 meters we had to stop so that he and us could rest. During one of these pauses, we heard close to us a series of piteous moans, as of someone moribund. We couldn't locate the source of the sound until someone, straining their ears, said it's coming from below us. We had effectively stopped on top of a collapsed roof. Clearing some of the tiles, we uncovered an elderly woman, half of whose body was completely burnt. She'd been entombed there all day, and was now barely alive. When we extracted her, she died instantly. Of course, you can imagine the sheer horror of all of this. I'm going to show you some slightly disturbing images with apologies. Arrupe also talks about treating children. And he conducts Mass, as is his job. He organizes Mass, which is a moment that he tries to draw inspiration for what to do next. And here he says, on concluding the Holy Sacrifice, we started pondering what to do next, as our original plan of helping nature by providing a good diet was proving insufficient. We were once again graced by the Lord's providence. At 8 in the morning, a villager who worked for us in the house appeared before me carrying a sack, and said, "Father, I would also like to help these poor people." And searching here and there, I came across a bag full of little white flakes, which looked to me like medicine. Take a look and see if they can be of use. The contents proved to be 15 kilograms of boric acid and the solution to our problem. With our underwear and the sheets with which we had in the house, we fashioned a great number of dressings and started our primitive, though highly effective treatment. They carry on and conduct a sort of a series of medical interventions on everyone that they can. And, I shan't go into detail. He goes into enormous detail of all the sort of technical medical stuff that he did, which I'm afraid is completely over my head as a translator. He's satisfied that this boric acid can be used to treat these grisly injuries that he's seeing time and time again. And of course, a lot of the injuries that he's seeing are incomprehensible. The effects of a nuclear bomb on a human being are not something that Pedro Arrupe or any other doctor in Japan would have been familiar with. So he's seeing people coming in with sunburns inside their body, with all manner of, bizarre ailments, and is doing his best to treat them. And he speaks of the children. He says, of all the cases that we treated, perhaps the most traumatic for us were those involving children. Everyone knows that in Japan, little children are adored. Such is the concern for their education that there's no illiteracy. All children go to school and know how to read and write. At the moment of the explosion, most children were in class in their respective schools, and consequently thousands were left separated from their parents, scattered across the city, wounded and unable to fend for themselves. We collected as many as we could, and taking them to Nagatska, we treated them immediately to try to prevent fevers and infections. We completely lacked any kind of analgesics, and some of our children were horribly wounded. One of them had a cut from ear to ear as a result of a roof tile that had fallen on his head. The edges of the wound were 1.5 centimeters wide. His scalp had been severed from the bone, and the laceration was caked with mud and shards of broken glass. The poor creature's cries as we treated him had a dire effect on everyone else in the house. So we saw no other option but to tie him in a blanket to a cart and take him to the top of a nearby hill. That place became an operating theatre, where we could do our work and he could scream to his heart's content without distressing anybody else. Having to perform these treatments was heartrending, but it made up for by being able to reunite children with their parents. Though the perfectly organized Japanese police, it was possible to contact the families of every single child who we cared for at our house. Within a few days, they began to arrive in Nagatsuka from Osaka, Tokyo, and beyond. So he goes on at great length discussing, in a sense, what he did in the immediate aftermath, which is a sort of grueling cycle of holding Catholic Mass and then treating the injured as best he could with sort of makeshift equipment. There's a sort of completely separate document that actually records a little bit of this, and it's a very interesting document from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Right? Here you can see an aerial image of sort of what happened to Hiroshima. And they say this, they say, we took under our care 50 refugees who'd lost everything. The majority of them had been wounded and not a few had dangerous burns. Father Rector treated the wounds as well he could with the few medicaments that he could, with effort gather up. He had to confine himself in general to cleansing the wounds of pyrrolic material. Even those with the smaller burns are very weak and all suffered from diarrhea. In the farmhouses in the vicinity, almost everywhere, there were also wounded. Father Rector made daily rounds and acted in the capacity of a painstaking physician and was a great Samaritan. Our work was, in the eyes of the people, a greater boost to Christianity than all our work during the preceding long years. And this experience of service for others, of living for others, became a sort of a central part, actually, of Pedro Arrupe's philosophy later in life, going on in life. Now, there's another event which occurred, and I think this is, in a sense, the concluding event in his book, in his memoir, of what took place, which he described as the third nuclear bomb. And that is, in 1946, in January 1st of 1946, the Japanese emperor signed a document called the Ningen Sengen, which is not very well known outside of Japan, but it's a document where the emperor renounced his divinity and said he's not a god, right? And it's an absolutely extraordinary legal document. Here's what Arrupe had to say of it. He regarded it as an absolute turning point in Japanese history. And he said, 3 days after the atomic explosion in Hiroshima, another bomb was dropped in Nagasaki. On the 3rd of September of that same year, 1945, on the deck of the Missouri, Japan signed her unconditional surrender to the North American forces. Finally, on the 1st of January of 1946, during the most important holiday in Japanese tradition, when the birthday of all the empire's subjects are simultaneously celebrated, the emperor ordered his people once again to tune into their radios. In a message transmitted from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, he acknowledged that the common belief in his divinity was false. He was a man, like any other. The dogma of faith, central to the Constitution and to the national ideology, had been shattered. This was the third atomic bomb, moral in nature, and much more devastating than the previous two that had exploded in the skies of Japan. And it's really on this note that Arrupe ends his book. And I think this idea of a third atomic bomb is very, very interesting, especially as a Japanese historian. There is an extraordinary turning point that one sees from the Meiji Restoration, from the mid-19th century Japan, all the way to 1945. And a lot of the predictions that observers and scholars made about what Japan would be like in the post-war were proven wrong. Right, there was a great deal of observers were convinced the Japanese were ready to fight to the death. There would be non-stop fighting following the occupation. It was, it was going to be a sort of never-ending bloodbath. But in fact, the emperor's admission that he was not a god and the sort of total surrender and the dismantling of this state religion, the dismantling of state Shinto, probably did play a significant part in terminating at least the religious component of this nationalist ideology. So I'm quite interested in Arrupe's observation that this was a third atomic bomb more powerful even than the first two. At any rate, Arrupe remained in Japan for another 20 years and became very important in the Society of Jesus in Japan, and then went on to have an illustrious career elsewhere. But he took some time out to return to Spain, and he gave a tour where he basically presented the content of today's lecture, where he tried to provide a sort of explanation of Japan, an explanation of Japanese history to eager audiences, and then he published it all in this book. And he seemed to, he maintained in a sense that traditional Jesuit attitude towards Japan. He's very taken with Japan, he likes it very much. And those of you that have seen that statue of Arrupe outside of him wearing Japanese clothes, I think that's quite indicative of how he felt. He wanted to fit in. He was a great admirer of Japanese culture, even as he was also its critic. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and open up for questions.